The boarding shuttles fought their way through swarms of ghost ships that materialized from the darkness like nightmares given form, while possessed pilots screamed challenges in languages that had been dead for millions of years. Jake gripped his weapon tighter as their shuttle shook under enemy fire, and he could see Captain Zexamoth doing the same, while Dr. Bennett worked frantically at a portable scanner, trying to map the interior of the monument from their approaching position. Their shuttle made it through the defensive screen and landed hard against the monument's surface, where ancient airlocks began opening automatically, as if the structure recognized their intent and was either welcoming them or preparing a trap. The boarding party consisted of Jake and Dr. Bennett from the human crew, plus Captain Zexamoth and two of his warriors named Kretak and Volneth, who had volunteered for the mission, knowing they would never see their homeworld again. They entered the monument, through corridors that were impossibly vast and filled with symbols that shifted and moved when observed directly, while whispers echoed from the walls in voices that belonged to every species the Void Herald had ever consumed. Dr. Bennett led them deeper into the structure, following readings from his scanner that pointed toward the control chamber at the monument's core, while behind them they could hear the sounds of pursuit as possessed defenders gave chase. The first attack came from creatures that had once been members of the ancient civilization, but were now twisted into forms that served the Void Herald and fought with weapons that fired concentrated hatred and despair. Captain Zexamoth and his warriors fought with the savage efficiency that made the Kethavar such feared opponents, while Jake and Dr. Bennett used human tactics and technology to complement their alien allies' natural combat abilities. They fought their way through level after level of the monument, while the Void Herald's voice echoed around them, promising eternal servitude in exchange for ending their futile resistance to its will. Dr. Bennett discovered that the monument was not just a prison, but also a massive psychic amplifier that had been designed to contain the entity's influence and prevent it from reaching beyond this system to threaten other worlds. The ancient civilization had built multiple fail-safe systems into the structure, but most had been damaged or destroyed during the original battle, and only one remained functional enough to restore the containment field as they descended deeper into the monument. The psychic pressure increased until it felt like walking through liquid madness, while the walls themselves seemed alive and hungry for their life force. Kretak fell when a possessed guardian tore through his armor with claws made of crystallized screams, but he managed to destroy his attacker before dying, and his sacrifice allowed the others to continue their mission. The control chamber lay behind doors that were sealed with locks that required the simultaneous input of genetic material from multiple species, and Jake realized that this was why the ancient weapon needed representatives from different civilizations. Dr. Bennett worked to understand the alien controls, while Captain Zexamoth and Volneth held the entrance against waves of possessed creatures that threw themselves forward with suicidal fury to prevent the activation. The scientists discovered that the failsafe required not just genetic material, but also the willing sacrifice of life force from each species represented, and that the process would drain their energy until nothing remained. Jake felt the weight of billions of lives resting on his shoulders as he placed his hand on the human interface, while Captain Zexamoth did the same at the Kethavar control, and both of them felt the ancient machinery beginning to respond. The Void Herald realized what they were attempting and launched a final desperate assault on the control chamber, while also trying to break their minds with visions of their homes burning and their families dying in agony. Dr. Bennett screamed as the entity focused its full attention on him and tried to prevent him from completing the activation sequence. But the scientist held on to his humanity long enough to input the final commands. Volanith died defending the chamber entrance, but his sacrifice bought them the precious seconds needed for the ancient weapon to fully power up while energy began building in the monument's core systems. Jake felt his life force being drained by the machine as it converted his essence into the power needed to restore the containment field, and he could see Captain Zeximoth experiencing the same process with stoic acceptance. The void herald's screams of rage and frustration echoed through the monument as it realized that its prison was being rebuilt around it, and that its chance for revenge against the living galaxy was slipping away. Dr. Bennett collapsed as the entity made one final attempt to possess him, but the scientist's dying act was to complete the failsafe activation and seal the monster back in its ancient cage. Outside the monument, the ghost ships began dissolving back into lifeless debris as the Void Herald's influence was cut off, and the possessed crew members collapsed as their minds were freed from alien control. The containment field snapped back into place with a sound like reality, healing itself, and the monument began sealing its entrances while purple light faded from its surface as the ancient evil was locked away once more. Jake felt his consciousness fading as the weapon drained the last of his life force, but he managed to look at Captain Zeximoth one final time and saw understanding and respect in the alien's eyes. The Kethvar captain spoke in his own language, but somehow Jake understood the words as a formal acknowledgement of honor between warriors who had died well in service to something greater than themselves. Amy Carter woke up on the bridge of the Meridian with no memory of her possession and found herself in command of a ship drifting in space near a monument that showed no signs of the terrible evil it contained. The surviving Kethvar ships had also recovered from their ordeal, and Admiral Vexetar himself appeared on their communication screen looking shaken and confused, but no longer under the influence of the ancient entity. Admiral Vexetar spoke slowly as he processed what had happened, and gradually understood that humans and Kethvar had worked together to save both their civilizations from a threat that transcended their petty territorial disputes. The debris field had returned to its previous state of lifeless wreckage floating in space, but now both species understood that it was a graveyard that deserved respect rather than exploitation. Amy transmitted the full record of their discovery and the battle that followed back to Earth Command, while the Kethvar did the same for their home government, and both reports emphasized the sacrifice made by their crews. The monument stood silent once more in the center of the ancient battlefield, but now it contained not just the Void Herald, but also the remains of Jake Morrison and Captain Zeximoth, who had died as brothers in arms. Admiral Vextar ordered his fleet to establish a permanent patrol around the system to ensure that the monument was never again disturbed, while Amy prepared to return to Earth with news of humanity's first real victory over an impossible enemy. The Kethvar Admiral's final transmission to the Meridian contained a formal recognition of the alliance that had saved both their peoples, and a promise that the sacrifice of their crews would never be forgotten. As the human and alien ships parted ways and headed back to their respective homes, they carried with them the knowledge that sometimes the greatest victories required the greatest sacrifices, and that even the oldest enemies could become allies when faced with true evil. The ancient battlefield returned to its eternal silence, but now it held a different meaning for both species, as a reminder that courage and sacrifice could triumph over any darkness no matter how old or powerful it might be. Jake forced himself to think clearly, despite the psychic pressure crushing down on his mind, and he realized that some of the Kethvar ships were still moving under their own control, which meant that not all of their crews had been possessed, yet Dr. Bennett managed to break free from a psychic attack long enough to report that his scans showed 3 Kethvar vessels were still operating independently, while the others had joined the growing fleet of ghost ships that served the Void Herald Jake, made a decision that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier, and ordered Maria to try establishing contact with the free Kethvar ships, even though she was fighting her own battle against possession, and her movements were becoming increasingly mechanical. The communication took several attempts because the psychic interference from the Void Herald made it difficult to maintain clear signals, but eventually Maria managed to reach the bridge of one of the surviving Kethvar vessels to Jake's. Surprised, the alien who appeared on their screen was not Admiral Vexitar, but a younger Kethvar commander named Captain Zex Moth, who looked as desperate and frightened as Jake felt, while his own crew struggled against the entity's influence captain. Zexmoth spoke quickly in broken English and explained that Admiral Vextar had been among the first to fall under possession and was now commanding the corrupted Kethvar ships that served the ancient evil they had awakened. Jake swallowed his pride and proposed an alliance between the remaining free crews because their only hope of survival lay in working together to activate the ancient failsafe weapon that Dr. Bennett had discovered in the Monument's records. Captain Zexmoth hesitated, for only a moment before agreeing, because he could see that the Void Herald represented a threat to all life in the galaxy, and that old rivalries meant nothing when faced with extinction. Dr. Bennett shared his research with the Kethvar science teams, and together they began working to understand the ancient technology, while ghost ships continued to emerge from the debris field, and possessed crew members tried to sabotage their efforts. The combined human and Kethvar crews discovered that the failsafe weapon was indeed built into the monument, but activating it would require a boarding party to penetrate the structure and reach its core, while the Void Herald defended its prison. Amy had been completely possessed by this point, and was working with inhuman efficiency to pilot the Meridian toward the growing fleet of ghost ships, but Jake managed to override her controls and keep their ship positioned near the free Kethvar vessels. Maria was fighting a losing battle against the entity's influence, and Jake could see that her personality was being slowly erased and replaced with something alien and hostile that served only the Void Herald's will. Captain Zexmoth reported that his own crew was suffering similar losses, and that time was running out, because once the entity had enough possessed servants, it would begin converting them into something even worse than simple puppets. Dr. Bennett made another crucial discovery when he found references to the ancient civilization's greatest warriors who had volunteered for a suicide mission to manually activate the failsafe after the automated systems had been destroyed in the battle. The weapon required the life force of beings from different species to power its containment field, and the original volunteers had known that they would die in the process, but they had been willing to make that sacrifice to save their people. Jake realized that he and Captain Zexamoth would need to lead a joint boarding party into the monument while their ships provided cover against the growing army of ghost vessels and possessed crews that served the Void Herald. The Kethvar captain understood the implications immediately and began selecting volunteers from among his remaining free crew members, while Jake did the same, knowing that anyone who entered the monument would likely never return. Dr. Bennett volunteered to join the boarding party because his knowledge of the ancient systems would be essential for locating and activating the failsafe weapon, even though it meant certain death for all involved. Amy broke free from her controls long enough to warn Jake that the Void Herald was preparing to launch a massive assault using both the ghost ships and the possessed vessels from both fleets, and that they had only minutes before the attack began. The entity had been gathering its strength while converting more of the ancient debris into functional warships, and now commanded a fleet that dwarfed anything either humanity or the Kethvar Empire had ever assembled. Captain Zexmoth coordinated with his remaining free ships to form a defensive perimeter around the monument, while Jake prepared the Meridian for what would likely be their final battle against impossible odds. Maria managed one last transmission to Earth Command, warning them about the threat before her mind was completely overwhelmed by the Void Herald's influence, and she joined the ranks of the possessed. The ghost ships began their attack with weapons that fired beams of pure darkness that could phase through normal matter and directly attack the life force of anyone they touched, while possessed crews worked to disable the free vessels. Jake watched his own crew. Members turn against him one by one as the entity's influence spread throughout the ship, and he realized that soon he would be fighting alone, except for Dr. Bennett and the few Kethvar who remained free. The battle around the monument became a desperate struggle between the last free minds in the system and an enemy that grew stronger with every passing moment as it added more possessed servants to its ranks. Captain Zexmoth's ship took heavy damage from a concentrated attack by Admiral Vextar's corrupted flagship, but the Kethvar captain managed to keep his vessel operational while his crew fought off boarding parties of possessed soldiers. Dr. Bennett completed his analysis of the ancient weapon and reported that the failsafe could be activated from a control chamber deep inside the monument, but reaching it would require fighting through levels of possessed defenders and psychic barriers. Jake made the decision to begin the boarding operation immediately because waiting any longer would only allow the Void Herald to grow stronger and make their mission even more impossible than it already was. The remaining free crew members prepared for what they knew would be a one-way trip into the heart of an ancient evil, while around them the battle raged between the forces of life and an entity that sought only destruction. Captain Zexmoth transmitted final coordinates to his homeworld, warning the Kethvar Empire about the threat, while Jake did the same for Earth Command, knowing that their sacrifice would mean nothing if both civilizations were not prepared for what was coming. The boarding shuttles launched from the surviving ships and headed toward the monument, while ghost ships swarmed around them, firing weapons that could unmake matter itself, and possessed pilots tried to ram them before they could reach their destination. Jake looked back one last time at the stars beyond the debris field and thought about all the worlds that would burn. If they failed while beside him, Captain Zexmoth clutched his weapon and prepared to die alongside his former enemies to save both their peoples. The thing that emerged from the broken monument was darkness, given form and consciousness, and Jake could feel its presence pressing against his mind like a weight that threatened to crush his sanity, while around him his crew struggled to maintain their grip on reality. Dr. Bennett was the first to understand what they were facing, because his scientific mind allowed him to process the impossible readings from his instruments, and he spoke in a voice filled with terror as he explained that the entity was something called the Void Herald. The Void Herald had been imprisoned in the monument for millions of years by a civilization that no longer existed, and its hatred for all living things had only grown stronger during its captivity, until it became a force of pure malevolence that sought only to destroy. Amy tried to pilot the Meridian away from the monument, but found that their engines would not respond, and that the ship was being held in place by forces that defied the laws of physics, while the Void Herald extended its influence outward like invisible tentacles. Maria cried out as the voices in her communications equipment became louder and more insistent, and Jake could see that her eyes were beginning to glow with the same purple light that emanated from the monument while she spoke words in a language that hurt to hear. The HFY ships were experiencing similar problems as their crews began to succumb to the Void Herald's psychic assault, and Jake watched. Through the view screen as Admiral Vextar's flagship started moving in erratic patterns, as if its pilot was no longer in control, Dr. Bennett worked frantically at his console, trying to understand the ancient records embedded in the debris field. And gradually he began to piece together the story of what had happened here millions of years ago, when the original inhabitants fought their final battle. The civilization that built the monument had been peaceful explorers, much like humanity, but they had encountered the Void Herald during their travels through space, and learned too late that it was a parasite that fed on the life force of entire worlds. The Void Herald could possess any living being and turn them into extensions of its will while slowly draining their life energy until nothing remained but empty shells that continued to serve its purpose, and it had used this ability to corrupt entire star systems. When the ancient civilization realized what they were facing, they gathered their greatest warriors and scientists and made the ultimate sacrifice by luring the Void Herald to this remote system where they could contain it, even if it meant their own destruction. The battle had raged for years as possessed. Ships fought against free ones while the Void Herald tried to break through the containment field that the ancients had built around the monument, and millions had died to keep it imprisoned. Jake felt the Void Herald's attention turn toward him, and suddenly his mind was filled with images of Earth burning, while human colonies fell one by one to an army of possessed ships that moved like a plague across the galaxy. The entity spoke directly into his thoughts, using a voice that sounded like the screaming of dying stars, and it promised him power beyond imagination if he would serve willingly instead of resisting until his mind broke under the assault. Amy began laughing in a way that sounded nothing like her normal voice, and when Jake looked at her, he could see that her eyes had turned completely black, while she spoke about the glory of serving the Herald and how wonderful it would be when all resistance ended. More crew members on both human and HFY ships began showing signs of possession as the Void Herald's influence spread outward from the monument, and Jake realized that soon there would be no free minds left to oppose the ancient evil. Dr. Bennett made a desperate discovery when he found references in the ancient records to a fail-safe weapon that the original civilization had built into the monument itself, but activating it would require specific conditions that might be impossible to meet. The weapon was designed to reinforce the prison and push the Void Herald back into containment, but it needed the combined life force of representatives from different species and could only be activated from inside the monument itself. Meanwhile, the possessed crew members began working together regardless of whether they were human or HFY, as the Void Herald used their bodies to start converting the ancient debris into new vessels for its consciousness. Dead ships that had floated in space for millions of years suddenly came to life as the entity poured its essence into them and began rebuilding their systems, using technology that combined the worst aspects of every civilization it had ever consumed. Jake watched in horror as ghost ships began emerging from the debris field with hulls that seemed to be made of living shadow and weapons that fired beams of pure entropy that could unmake matter at the molecular level, the void. Harold laughed inside his mind and showed him visions of these ghost ships spreading across the galaxy like a cancer, while possessed crews worked tirelessly to convert every living world into fuel for their master's endless hunger. Dr. Bennett shouted that he had found more information about the ancient weapon, but his voice was barely audible over the psychic screaming that filled the air as more minds fell under the Void Herald's control and joined its growing army. The scientist explained that the failsafe could only be activated by beings who had not yet been fully possessed, and that it required them to willingly sacrifice their life force to power the containment field, but the process would trap them inside the monument forever. Jake felt his own mind beginning to slip as the Void Herald's influence pressed harder against his consciousness, and he could see purple light starting to gather at the edges of his vision while alien thoughts tried to take root in his brain. Amy turned toward him with her black eyes and reached out with hands that crackled with dark energy while she spoke, in the Herald's voice, about how much easier it would be if he just stopped fighting and accepted his fate. Maria had completely succumbed to possession and was working at her station with inhuman efficiency as she used the ship's communications array to coordinate with the possessed Kethvar crews and the growing fleet of ghost ships. Dr. Bennett was one of the last free minds on either ship, and he continued his desperate research while fighting off psychic attacks that tried to turn him into another servant of the ancient evil that had once ruled this part of the galaxy. The Void Herald began demonstrating its power by reaching out across space to touch the minds of humans and Kethvar on distant worlds, and Jake could feel the entity's satisfaction as it tasted the fear of billions of potential victims. Ghost ships continued to emerge from the debris field in ever greater numbers, while the possessed crews worked to repair and upgrade them using knowledge stolen from every civilization that the Void Herald had ever encountered. Jake knew that if the entity escaped this system, it would spread across the galaxy like wildfire, and that both humanity and the Kethvar Empire would fall within months as their own. People turned against them. The only hope lay in the ancient failsafe weapon, but Jake could see that Dr. Bennett was losing his battle against possession, and that soon there would be no one left with the knowledge needed to activate the containment. System A's more of his crew fell under the Void Herald's control. Jake realized that their only chance was to find allies among the few remaining free Kethvar and work together despite their long history of hatred and war. The irony was not lost on him that humanity's survival might depend on cooperating with their greatest enemies, while an even greater threat prepared to consume everything they had ever known or loved. The screaming in their minds stopped as suddenly as it had started, and Jake shook his head to clear the ringing in his ears, while Amy worked to restore their ship's systems, and Dr. Bennett checked his instruments to see if the monument had caused any permanent damage to their equipment. Maria was the first to notice the new contacts appearing on their sensors, and she called out a warning that multiple ships were approaching their position at high speed from the edge of the debris field, and that their energy signatures matched those of Kethvar war vessels. Jake felt his stomach sink, because the Kethvar were humanity's most dangerous enemies, and their ships were faster and better armed than anything in the human fleet, and he knew that a single exploration vessel like the Meridian would not stand a chance against even one of their warships. Amy confirmed Maria's report and added that she was detecting at least 6 Kethvar vessels moving in formation toward their position, and that they would arrive within minutes, so Jake ordered her to prepare for immediate departure. While he tried to think of a way to escape, Dr. Bennett protested that they could not leave now when they had just discovered the most important archaeological find in human history. But Jake reminded him that they would all be dead if they stayed to fight the Kethvar, and that dead scientists could not report their discoveries to anyone. The first Kethvar ship emerged from behind a large piece of debris. and Jake could see its sleek, predatory shape through the view screen with its hull painted in the red and black colors that marked it as belonging to Admiral Vexitar's fleet, and he knew their situation had just become much worse. Admiral Vexitar was known throughout human space as a ruthless commander who had destroyed dozens of human colonies and who took no prisoners in battle, and who would certainly not hesitate to destroy the Meridian if Jake refused to surrender immediately. Maria received an incoming transmission from the HFY flagship, and Jake told her to put it through on the main screen where Admiral Vexitar's reptilian face appeared, with his yellow eyes glowing with hatred and his mouth twisted in what might have been a smile. Admiral Vexitar spoke in accented but clear English and demanded that the humans withdraw from HFY territory immediately or face destruction, and he claimed that the ancient battlefield belonged to his people by right of conquest, and that humans had no business being there. Jake stood up from his command chair and faced the screen, and told Admiral Vexitar that this sector of space was neutral territory according to the treaties signed by both their governments, and that the Meridian had every right to be conducting scientific research. Here Admiral Vexitar laughed and said that treaties meant nothing when they stood between the HFY and their destiny, and that the ancient artifacts in this system would give his people the power they needed to crush humanity once and for all. Dr. Bennett stepped forward and tried to explain that the monument and debris field were archaeological treasures that belonged to all sentient species, and that destroying them would be a crime against history itself. But Admiral Vexitar cut him off with a snarl. The HFY admiral said that he cared nothing for ancient history and that he would give the humans exactly 1 minute to begin their withdrawal, or he would open fire and turn their ship into debris to add to the battlefield around them. Jake knew that running was their only option, but something made him hesitate and look back at the monument floating in the darkness behind them, and he felt a strange compulsion to stay and protect the ancient structure from the HFY urged him to give the order to retreat, because their shields would not last long against HFY weapons. But Jake found himself saying that they would not abandon their discovery, and that the HFY would have to go through them to reach the monument. Admiral Vexitar's eyes widened with surprise and then narrowed with anger as he realized that the humans intended to fight, and he cut the transmission without another word while his ships began moving into attack formation. The first HFY missiles streaked across the space between the fleets, and Amy threw the Meridian into evasive maneuvers, while their point defense systems tried to intercept the incoming weapons, but several impacts sent shockwaves through the ship. Jake ordered Maria to send out a distress signal on all frequencies, while Amy continued her desperate attempts to keep them alive, and Dr. Bennett worked at his station trying to find some weakness in the HFY ships that they could exploit. The battle moved closer to the ancient monument as Amy used the larger pieces of debris for cover, while the HFY ships pursued them with methodical precision, and Jake realized that they were being herded toward the center of the battlefield. A HFY plasma beam lanced out and struck one of the debris pieces near the monument, causing it to explode in a brilliant flash that lit up the entire area and sent fragments spinning through space in all directions. One of the fragments struck the side of the monument, and Jake watched in horror as cracks began to spread across its surface, while the purple symbols flared brighter and began pulsing faster as if something inside was trying to break free. Dr. Bennett shouted a warning that the monument's energy readings were spiking beyond anything his instruments could measure and that the structure appeared to be destabilizing, but his words were lost in the sound of another HFY attack. Amy tried to position the Meridian between the HFY ships and the monument to prevent further damage. But Admiral Vextar seemed to realize what she was doing and ordered his ships to concentrate their fire on the ancient structure itself. The combined firepower of 6 HFY warships struck the monument simultaneously, and Jake watched as more cracks appeared across its surface, while the purple light grew brighter and began to pulse so fast that it became almost continuous. Something was happening inside the monument because Jake could hear a sound like thunder coming from its direction, and the space around the structure began to ripple as if reality itself was being disturbed by whatever was trapped. Within Dr. Bennett's instruments went crazy as energy readings climbed beyond the scale of measurement, and he reported that the monument was no longer just cracking, but was actually beginning to open like some kind of ancient doorway or prison. The HFY ships had stopped firing and were backing away from the monument as their sensors detected the same impossible energy readings that the Meridian was seeing, and even Admiral Vextar seemed to realize that they had made a terrible mistake. Dark energy began pouring out of the cracks in the monument, and wherever it touched the debris field, the ancient wreckage began to glow with the same purple light, while pieces that had been dead for millions of years suddenly showed signs of activity. Amy reported that her navigation systems were completely failing, and that space itself seemed to be folding around the monument while time moved differently in pockets throughout the debris field, and some areas seemed to exist outside normal reality. Maria screamed as her communications equipment filled with voices speaking in languages that had been dead for eons, while Dr. Bennett watched his sensors detect movement among the debris as if the ancient battlefield was coming back to life. The monument split open with a sound like the universe screaming, and something emerged from within that Jake's mind could not fully comprehend because it existed in more dimensions than human senses could perceive, but he knew with absolute certainty that it was ancient and powerful and filled with rage. Both the human and HFY ships found themselves helpless as waves of psychic energy washed over them, and crew members on both sides began to hear whispers in their minds, promising power and revenge. While their instruments showed impossible readings, Jake realized that their battle had awakened something that should have remained buried forever, and that both humans and HFY would pay the price for disturbing the ancient grave that lay hidden among the stars. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the USS Meridian, watching the stars through the main view screen and thinking about how quiet space had become in this sector and how his crew had been scanning empty systems for 3 weeks without finding anything interesting until today, when Dr. Lucas Bennett called from the science station with excitement in his voice, saying that his sensors were picking up something strange ahead. Amy Carter turned from her pilot controls and looked at Jake with curiosity while Maria Santos stopped her communications work to listen as Dr. Bennett explained that there was a massive gravitational anomaly just 2 light hours away, and that it was unlike anything in the database, and that the readings made no sense according to normal physics. Jake ordered Amy to change course toward the anomaly and told Maria to send a message back to Earth Command reporting their discovery, while Dr. Bennett continued his scans and muttered about impossible energy signatures that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat but came from empty space. As the Meridian moved closer to the anomaly, Amy noticed that her navigation systems began acting strangely, and that the ship's computers kept recalculating their position as if they were moving through space that folded in on itself, and she reported this to Jake, who frowned and asked Dr. Bennett for more information. Bennett looked up from his console with wide eyes and said that they were approaching what appeared to be a battlefield from an ancient war, but that the debris field stretched across several light years, and contained wreckage from ships that were impossibly large and built from materials he had never seen before through the view screen. They could see the first pieces of debris floating in the darkness, and Jake felt his breath catch in his throat because the wreckage was massive beyond comprehension, with hull fragments the size of small moons drifting slowly through space and covered in symbols that seemed to move when he looked directly at them. Amy guided the Meridian carefully through the outer edge of the debris field, while Dr. Bennett scanned everything they passed and reported that some of the wreckage was giving off energy readings that suggested the battles here had ended millions of years ago, long before humans had even developed civilization on Earth. Maria tried to boost their communications array to get a better signal back to Earth Command, but found that something in the debris field was interfering with their transmissions and creating strange echoes that sounded almost like voices speaking in languages that did not exist as they moved deeper into the battlefield. Jake began to feel uneasy, because the silence around them felt wrong and heavy, as if the space itself was holding its breath and waiting for something to happen, while the ancient wreckage drifted past their ship like the bones of giants. Dr. Bennett discovered that many of the larger debris pieces contained what looked like weapon scars and blast patterns that suggested the battle here had been fierce and desperate, with ships firing at each other until they were completely destroyed and left nothing but fragments. Floating in the void, Amy reported that her instruments were detecting something massive at the center of the debris field, and that whatever it was seemed to be the source of the gravitational anomaly that had brought them here in the first place. So Jake ordered her to set course for the center, while maintaining safe distance from the larger debris pieces. As they flew deeper into the ancient battlefield, the crew began to notice strange effects on their minds and bodies, with Maria reporting that she kept hearing whispers in her headset, even when no communications were coming through, and Amy saying that she felt like someone was watching her from the empty spaces between the debris. Dr. Bennett found records embedded in some of the wreckage that were written in symbols similar to those they had seen on the hull fragments. And when he tried to translate them, using the ship's computers, the results made little sense, except for repeated references to something called the Void, herald and warnings about keeping it contained. Jake felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up when he heard the name, and he could not explain why, but something about those words filled him with dread, as if they carried a weight of ancient fear that had been passed down through the very atoms of space itself. The Meridian continued its approach to the center of the debris field, and soon they could see their destination clearly through the view screen, and Jake felt his mouth go dry. Because what waited for them was not another piece of wreckage, but a massive structure that looked like a tomb or monument built from black stone that seemed to absorb light. The structure was enormous, and covered in the same shifting symbols they had seen on the debris. But these symbols glowed with a faint purple light that pulsed in rhythm with the gravitational anomaly and seemed to be counting down to something that Jake did not want to think about. Amy brought the Meridian to a stop at what she hoped was a safe distance from the monument, while Dr. Bennett worked frantically at his console trying to understand what they were looking at, and Maria attempted to record everything for their report back to Earth Command. Dr. Bennett announced that his scans indicated the monument was not built from any known material, and that it was generating energy signatures that defied explanation, while also creating some kind of field that made space-time behave differently in its immediate vicinity. Jake stared at the ancient monument and felt a chill run down his spine, because he could swear that the symbols on its surface were moving faster now, as if responding to their presence, and that something inside the structure was beginning to wake up after sleeping for millions of years. Maria gasped and pointed at her communications console, where her equipment was picking up what sounded like a heartbeat coming from the direction of the monument, and the rhythm matched the pulsing of the symbols on its surface exactly as if the entire structure was alive. Amy checked her navigation systems and discovered that time was moving differently near the monument, with her chronometers showing impossible readings that suggested minutes were passing like hours in some areas, while hours compressed into seconds in others. Bennett looked up from his scans with fear in his eyes and told Jake that whatever was inside the monument was responding to their presence, and that the energy readings were climbing steadily, as if something very old and very powerful was beginning to stir from a long sleep. Jake made the decision to move the meridian back to a safer distance. But before Amy could engage the engines, the monument suddenly flared with brilliant purple light, and every system on their ship began malfunctioning, while the crew heard a sound like screaming that seemed to come from inside their own minds.